So, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this evening's webinar, the next one in our series of Hedge Talks as part of our first ever National Hedgerow Week with a theme of Talk to the Hedge. My name is Louise Bow. I'm the Close the Gap project manager from the Tree Council. And tonight we have Buzzy beasts, crawly creepers and nectar sippers of the hedgerows. And we've got two smashing guests to talk to us this evening who I'll introduce in a moment. But just to give you a little bit of an introduction, Close the Gap is a project that we're working on at the moment all about hedgerows. And it's around having more, bigger, healthier, bushier hedgerows across the country for all the benefits that they bring in terms of biodiversity, capturing carbon, air pollution, well-being, as well as adding beauty to our landscape and townscapes and all the amazing benefits that hedgerows bring to us. And it's a project that is funded by the government, a Green Recovery Fund through DEFRA, and it's being administered through the National Heritage Lottery Fund. And the Tree Council is the lead partner on the project, but we are actually delivering it with a host of other organisations and partners, one of whom is the University of Reading, and we have Mike here tonight from University of Reading. Also the People's Trust for Endangered Species, FWAG, the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group, the Worshipful Gardeners, and More Trees down in Devon. So there's a whole host of organisations working hard to make things better for hedgerows this year. So our guests this evening, we've got Dr. Michael Garrett from the University of Reading, Principal Research Fellow, and also Sean Stevenson, who's the chairman of the Buckinghamshire Beekeepers Association. In terms of a few logistics, our speakers are going to introduce and cover their sessions. Then there'll be time at the end for you to ask questions. If you do have any questions, please post them in the Q&A part of the site, and obviously any other comments or chit chat, feel free to just put in the chat function. But if you put any questions in the Q&A, it just helps us to keep track of them and make sure we can answer as many of those as possible at the end of the session. Okay, so without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. If you'd like to kick off then, please.
Thank you very much, Louise. So I'll share screen. If you could just confirm if it's working, please, that would be really good.
Yeah, it's looking, yeah, we can see that, Mike. If you just put it in slide view, that'll be great. Perfect, that's great, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Louise. And yeah, today I'll be talking about invertebrates, predominantly in hedgerows. So I'm a researcher based at the University of Reading. I guess I'm an entomologist, I suppose, but I'm particularly interested about those creepy crawlies and those invertebrates that are pests, but also beneficials, those things that help us grow crops, but also those things that hinder us from growing crops. So that's what my talk will focus on today. And yeah, at the University of Reading, myself, we're part of the Close the Gap project. I'm really excited to be part of the project, looking to try and better understand the role hedgerows have, delivering multiple benefits, but including their benefits for biodiversity and other invertebrates. So why are hedgerows so great then? Well, we've heard from Louise that they deliver all sorts of great benefits for us, including capturing carbon to mitigate climate change, flood prevention and mitigating effects of pollution, shelter for livestock, wood fuel, but they're also a really important habitat for wildlife, and that includes a number of key species and rare species like bats, dormice, and a number of bird species. But they're also key habitats for those invertebrates, particularly important invertebrates like pollinators and those insects that help control pests. So that's what I want to be talking about today, and why hedgerows are so important for these guys. So throughout my presentation, I've actually got a few questions. It's going to work, I guess, a bit like a pub quiz, so you can answer these questions at home and test yourself, and basically, so I hope it'll help you keep concentrated on the talk. So throughout my presentation, there'll be a few questions, and at the end, I'll provide the answers, and you can see how well you did, and test your knowledge on insects and hedgerows. So first of all, the first group of hedgerow heroes that I want to talk about are the pollinators. And of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with this pollinator. This is the honeybee, and honeybees are amazing. They're really important for pollinating our crops, and of course, they produce nice honey as well, which is really important and a real benefit. But honeybees aren't the only bee that we have in the UK, and actually there are very many other species too. I'm sure you're familiar with this bee. This is a bumblebee. So there are quite a few species of bumblebee in the UK, but they're not the only other bees as well. There's very many. One of my questions will be on the number of bee species, so I'm not going to give the game away now. But there's a real diversity of bees that we find in the UK: leafcutter bees, mining bees, mason bees, and they're a really diverse group. And these bees live in different habitats and are important for different things. So, question 1 of our quiz is, so how many bee species are there in the UK? And I've given you a couple of options here to help you along. So is there between 10 to 20 species of bee, between 50 to 100 species of bee, or between 200 and 250 species of bee in the UK? And the answers will be at the end.
Sean's not allowed to answer that one.
Yeah. So if these other wild bees don't produce honey, it's only the honeybee that produces honey that we harvest. Why are these other bees important? Well, that's because they're really important pollinators. So here you can see a nice picture of a andrenid bee. So this is a ground nesting bee, and at the moment you will see it on an apple flower. So we've done quite a lot of work on apple orchards down in Kent, and this andrenid bee has landed on this apple flower to collect nectar to feed itself, but also collect pollen as well to take back to its nest, a little hole in the ground, to feed its larva, feed its offspring. So it's foraging on this apple flower. But actually, as the bee flies from flower to flower in the apple orchard, it inadvertently moves pollen around, and this is reproduction for the apple tree. And this pollination is required so that the apple tree will set fruit and provide apples for the farmer, but also apples for us as consumers. So these pollinators are really important in underpinning food production, food on which we all rely. And amazingly, around 75% of globally grown crop species depend to some extent on insects, but also other pollinators as well. So many of the fruit and vegetables that we all enjoy are dependent on animal pollinators, and particularly insects in most cases. And it's not just bees, there are a lot of other insect pollinators out there as well, many flies, beetles, butterflies, depending on the crop, depending on the region. There are loads of different kinds of pollinators on which we rely. But if you like coffee and chocolate, you'll also be pleased to hear that both of these depend on these really important pollinators as well. So if you're not fussed about getting your 5 a day in terms of fruit and veg, then without insect pollinators, we wouldn't have coffee or chocolate either. So if that doesn't highlight their importance, I don't know what does. But yeah, so they're really important, a group of organisms, those that pollinate our crops. So on to the second question then. So if bees and other pollinators were to disappear suddenly tomorrow, which would be a disaster, if they were, how long do you think humanity would be able to survive for if that happened? To the nearest year. Okay, so that's pollinators and about how great they are. On to the next group of insects and invertebrates. And these are those guys that eat those crop pests that are a real problem for farmers and gardeners, like aphids and whitefly. Pests like that, the insects and invertebrates that eat those, we call them natural enemies. And there's loads of different kinds, and they're really important in maintaining crop production and helping farmers and gardeners and helping them grow these crops and reducing reliance on pesticides, for example, to control these many pests. So this is a photo of a lacewing. So these are really important natural enemies. They crawl around on crops eating aphids, helping control aphid populations, or green flies as they're called. Another really important natural enemy, this is a ground beetle. And these guys love eating slugs. Again, a really important pest of lots of different plants and crops. Staphylina beetles, another group of beetles, a diverse group that eat lots of different things, but some of them are really important natural enemies of crop pests. Centipedes, again, these are predatory invertebrates, often living in the soil and help control a number of soil pests as well. Spiders, not popular with everybody, but again, a really diverse group, and many of them are really important at controlling pests in crops and in gardens. And these guys are parasitoid wasps. So they're actually related to the wasps you might be more familiar with, those with the kind of black and yellow wasps. But there's there's very many species of other wasps, and these are called parasitoid wasps. And actually, a lot of them lay their eggs in other insects, and some of these other insects are pests. So again, they're really important natural enemies. Hoverflies, it's actually their larvae. Some of these are predatory, and again, eat aphids and other small insects, are an important at controlling pests. And finally, something you might recognize, the ladybird. Of course, everyone loves the ladybird. That's because they are voracious predators of aphids. So there's real diversities of these other invertebrates that are really important to us. And actually, very many of these species are really reliant on hedgerows as a habitat. These hedgerows provide shelter, alternative food resources, flowering plants, for which some of these also feed on nectar, and utilize those hedgerows as a habitat for lots of this invertebrate diversity. So on to the next question in our quiz then. I showed you a few examples of natural enemies, of kind of predatory invertebrates there. I wonder if anyone knows what this one is. It looks a bit alien, and if you put alien down, you'll only get half a point for that one. But yeah, I wonder if anyone recognises that. So why are hedgerows so important for these hedgerow heroes, both the pollinators and the natural enemies that eat our crop pests? Well, that isn't a question in the quiz, because I'm about to talk about why they're so important. But this is an aerial photo of a kind of typical intensive agricultural landscape that you might find in the UK. This photo is actually from near where I live in Swindon. And you can see there's lots of crop fields here. And these fields are growing important crops like wheat, barley, oilseed rape, beans, crops which we rely on to produce food, of course. But a lot of this landscape is not particularly hospitable to our hedgerow heroes like pollinators and natural enemies. There's not a lot of shelter, there's not a lot of forage resource for them. But you may also notice in this picture, there's lots of linear features running across this landscape, and these are hedgerows. So potentially these hedgerows are a really important habitat in these agricultural landscapes, supporting our hedgerow heroes. So on to the next question in our quiz then. So I've shown a few photos of lots of hedgerows. Clearly there's lots of them, it seems. So how many kilometres of hedgerows are there estimated to be currently in the UK? And I'll give you a hint. Answers to the nearest 100,000 would be good. But not all hedgerows are equal. So we can see a lot of hedgerows in this photo, but they're not all equal. Some hedgerows are really good. Some have a real diversity of plant species. Like this hedgerow, you can see lots of different plant species growing in this hedgerow, and they've got a nice, lush, grassy hedge bank as well. So a hedgerow like this provides a really valuable habitat for our hedgerow heroes, our pollinators and our natural enemies. Lots of places to shelter, lots of places to feed. Some other hedges are perhaps not so good as a habitat for our invertebrates like this. They may have large gaps in them, they may be heavily cut, there may be fewer species of plant within the hedgerow, and maybe the hedge bank isn't quite as bushy and lush as it might be. So not all hedgerows are equal. So at Reading, we carried out a project to try and better understand how important hedgerows are for our pollinators and natural enemies in agricultural environments. And we wanted to understand whether hedge quality matters. Are good hedgerows better than bad hedgerows, for example? And how much so? And we also wanted to understand whether the local landscape in which you find a hedgerow affects how valuable that hedgerow is as a habitat for our different species and biodiversity. So for this study, we worked in 4 different landscapes. And you can see from the map in the UK that where they are. So north of Reading, the university where I'm based, and up towards the north of London. And in each of these landscapes, we had 4 hedgerows that we studied. 2 of those hedgerows were considered good hedgerows. So they had a real diversity of woody species associated with them. They were nice big hedgerows, not too many gaps. And 2 of those hedgerows were of poorer quality. So they might have had gaps, they might have been heavily cut. And then also 2 of those hedgerows were in a landscape that was predominantly agriculture. So it was dominated by agricultural fields, and there weren't many other habitats like woodlands or low input grasslands close to the hedge. And then 2 of them were in a landscape where there was alternative habitats around that might be good for our invertebrates, for our hedgerow heroes. And then at each of these hedgerows in our study, we carried out surveys to try and understand how the hedge was supporting different groups of bugs, like pollinators and our natural enemies. So we carried out pollinator surveys along the hedgerows, and here we walk along the hedgerows and we recorded the different species that we see visiting flowers on the hedgerows, whether it's bumblebees or solitary bees or hoverflies, butterflies. We recorded all these. And to measure our spiders and our beetles, we use pitfall traps. Pitfall traps are great. They're a simple device. They're kind of just like a plastic cup that you bury into the ground, and they're there to catch any insects that are crawling along the ground. And they might inadvertently fall into the pitfall trap, and then we come along a few days later, collect them up and count how many there are in there and how many different species are in there. So they're a really good tool for measuring the abundance, i.e. the number of, and the diversity, i.e. the number of different species that we find in an area. Now we've got some graphs from the study. This graph shows how the abundance of some important natural enemies like spiders and beetles, so how the number of these different invertebrates changes as you get further away from the hedge. And as you can see, for a number of these groups, the numbers that we found declined significantly away from the hedgerow, up to 50 meters into the field, where numbers really fell off for some of the groups. And this is really important because it highlights to us how important these hedgerows are as a habitat for these different species, and that they spill over from those hedgerows into the crop fields, and there they help control crop pests in those crop fields. But we also found that hedgerow quality, whether it's a good hedge or a bad hedge, also affected how important they are as a habitat for our different groups. So we actually found that on a good hedgerow with a real diversity of plant species, particularly, we found twice as many bumblebees foraging on those hedgerows than some of those poorer quality hedgerows. And we also found significantly more spiders as well associated with these good quality hedgerows. So the way the hedge is managed as well is really important in determining how important a habitat they are for our hedgerow heroes. We also found that the hedge bank, so those species of plants that exist under the hedgerow and around the hedgerow, are really important for particularly hoverflies. We found loads of hoverflies foraging for nectar, particularly on those flowering plants that we find in the hedgerow bank that aren't actually part of the hedgerow itself. So again, that hedgerow and the hedgerow bank together make a really important habitat. And we also found that the number of bees that we find utilising a hedgerow, so when you do your survey, you see loads more bees on hedgerows that are actually in landscapes that are dominated by agriculture and fields, which highlights how that hedgerows are particularly important in intensive landscapes where there aren't alternative habitats for these pollinators to exist. Actually, you find lots more of them utilising those hedgerows for forage and to feed on. So highlighting how important the hedgerows are, particularly in intensive landscapes with lots of farming going on. So through that study, we really started to understand and build a picture about how important hedgerows are for our hedgerow heroes and how hedge quality matters. So we're now working with farmers and we're looking at trying to understand the best ways of managing hedgerows so that they can be the best habitat that they can be for invertebrates in these landscapes. And as part of the Close the Gap project, that's what we're really interested in doing, and also trying to understand how the local context matters. And clearly hedgerows are really important in these kinds of landscapes, so protecting the hedgerows we've got is key, but also putting new hedgerows into areas where they're really needed is a key thing that will deliver real benefits for biodiversity in these areas. So I've talked about a project that we carried out in particularly the countryside and in a farming landscape, but hedgerows are also really important in urban areas as well. A recent study, for example, showed that there are as many bee species in urban areas as there are in nature reserves. So clearly these urban areas are a real important habitat for some of our hedgerow heroes, and that's because of parks and gardens and things like that can provide a really good habitat. But that includes the hedgerows that we find in urban areas like towns and cities. So it's really important to protect those. So what can we all do to engage more with hedgerows? Well, as you know, it's National Hedgerow Week this week, so I hope we're all becoming a bit more aware of the importance of hedgerows and where hedgerows are, and I know I am. So first of all, we can start talking more about hedgerows. I think that's a really good idea. Tell your friends, let's sing the praises of these really important habitats. But also, if you're lucky enough to have your own hedgerow or a garden with a hedge in it or some hedge species in it, then letting it grow is a really good thing to do. So from our research, we found that having lots of different plants in your hedgerow and protecting that hedgerow bank, and not cutting that hedgerow too often, and cutting it at the right time, so in winter, is a really good thing to do to make that hedgerow as good as it can be for our hedgerow heroes. And yet we love messy bottoms in our hedgerows. So as we showed those plants that grow at the bottom of those hedgerows, like dandelions, brambles, ivy, they're all really good plants supporting loads of different insects and hedgerow heroes. And if you're lucky enough to plant a hedge, then do it. We can't have too many hedges around. We need more hedges. And of course, there is a continued webinars this week as well as part of National Hedgerow Week, and tomorrow there'll be a talk specifically on urban hedgerows. So I've touched on that, but there'll be a talk tomorrow on urban hedgerows, talking about the benefits that they deliver as well. So the answers to our questions then that ran through the quiz. So now you can test yourself, see how well you did. The first question was, how many bee species do we have in the UK? Well, I can tell you C is the answer, and there's between 200 and 250 bee species. Actually, I think there's 229 bee species, nearly 30 species of bumblebee, but then over 200 species of other wild bees as well. So they're an amazingly diverse group. So the next question was, if bees and other pollinators disappeared tomorrow, how long would humanity last? Well, we often hear a lot about the kind of the end of the world and the decline of bees. And you know, in the presentation, I talked about how important bees are in supporting, and other pollinators are in supporting crop production. But actually, a lot of the crops we eat, particularly staple crops like rice, wheat, maize, things like that, they're not actually pollinated by insects. And in fact, they're wind or self-pollinated. So we'd still be able to produce these crops actually if bees disappeared tomorrow. So we wouldn't disappear immediately, but what would happen is it become much harder to grow, and it become much more expensive to consume lots of the fruit and vegetables that we rely on for healthy diets. So without pollinators, it become much more difficult to produce these crops, and they're of course really important in supporting wild ecosystems as well. So a bit of a trick question there. I don't think humanity would end, but life would be a lot less nice and more difficult without pollinators. So I wonder if anyone knew what this was. So this actually is a ladybird larva. So this is what a ladybird looks like before it pupates into its adult form. So this is a ladybird larva, and again, they're really important because even as larvae, lots of them eat aphids and are real gardeners' friends. So if you find these in your garden, don't get rid of them. They're doing a good job. And finally, how many kilometres of hedgerows are there estimated to be in the UK? Well, it's a reasonably tricky thing to estimate, but they're probably between 500 and 700,000 kilometres of hedgerows in the UK. I mean, it sounds like a lot, but actually the amount of hedgerows, or the distance of hedgerows, declined by half since the Second World War due to agricultural expansion, making fields larger. A lot of hedgerows have been removed. So we definitely need to increase the numbers of hedgerows that we've got. So I'd just like to finish by saying thank you to the Tree Council for hosting this meeting and inviting me to speak. And thank you to all the farmers who let us carry out research on their land. And thank you very much to everyone for listening. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. That was great. Really interesting. Really interesting. I've definitely learned a few things there. So I think I got one question right. But yeah, that was really fascinating. Really great. So we'll hang fire for any questions and do them all at the end if that's okay. So we can have Sean next if you're ready, Sean, to
yes, I'll go.
Bring us into the wonderful world of bees.
That's come up in the wrong place. So let me just go.
That's okay. That's okay. While you're doing that, just a quick question, a practical one on one of your slides, Mike. Somebody asked what SNH stood for on the slides. Is it Scottish Natural Heritage, Semi-Natural Habitat?
Yeah, you got it right. Semi-natural habitat. That's
okay,
it. Yeah, I should have put it in full there. But yeah, that's semi-natural habitat, which is often what we sort of refer to as kind of there's not much true natural habitat left in the UK. So generally, most habitat is managed to some extent. So we call it semi-natural if it's quite naturalised habitat. So that's semi-natural habitat.
Thank you. And somebody's asked about notes after the session. I don't think we'll be generally sharing the notes, but I've just reminded to everyone we are recording the session. So if you want to watch it again or share and take some notes, or if you want to share it with others who are not able to join us tonight, then all of the sessions this week, or almost all of the sessions this week, are being recorded. So you can watch them again, or like I say, share them with others who aren't able to join. So we'll send the links around for those later in the week. Okay, give me the nod, Sean, when you're ready.
I'm ready.
Ready for action. Okay, go for it.
Okay, thank you very much, Louise. My name is Sean Stimson. I'm the chairman of Buckinghamshire Beekeepers Association, but I'm not going to talk about any honeybees tonight. I'm going to be talking about general pollinators within hedgerows. Going back to what Mike was saying about the number of bee species, in Buckinghamshire we're quite species rich. There are recordings of over 140 different species of bees within Buckinghamshire alone, which is, we're very lucky because we have a lot of chalkland, and that's very, very species rich. I'm not an expert. I'm not an entomologist. I'm actually an electronics engineer. And so I'm going to talk to you and take you through, I'd like to call them my holiday slides, but they're not. They're slides locally around where I live, about hedgerows and places I've visited recently, and talking about different types of hedges and my views on particularly the types of things that we should maybe be planting within our hedgerows to help pollinators survive the long season. And I'll come through that as I go along. I have to admit, and I'm going to put my hand right up that just now, this is two of my hedgerows in my garden. On the left-hand side, you can see a beech hedge, and on the right-hand side, you can see a yew hedge, and they're monocultures. They are not ideal, and hopefully by the end of the session, you'll realize they're not ideal hedges. But hedges have to have purposes, and sometimes the purpose is to look after pollinators, and in this case, the purpose is to have a dividing partition between my neighbours and ourselves. But I have tilted my cap a bit to on the left hand side. I've put in some laburnum, so that's two laburnum trees which are coming up through the beech hedge, and underplanting in the beech hedge is forget-me-not. So forget-me-not is an absolutely fantastic early flower. Most people consider them weeds and tear them up in their gardens, but they have great sources of nectar for insects and pollen, and they flower early in the season. At the end there, you'll see a sycamore tree, and sycamores are one of the early trees that come out. And trees are really, really beneficial for pollinators, and because they're 3D. A lot of us talk about when we're thinking of pollinators is planting wildflower meadows. But if you take, for instance, a lime tree, one lime tree is the equivalent of half a football pitch of wildflower meadow. So having trees and having mature trees are great sources of pollen and nectar. And bees in particular get a lot of, because of the flowers of the Acer species of the sycamore and field maple, which are the ones I have in my garden. They have very open flowers and are excellent sources of early nectar and pollen for the pollinators. And the right hand side, the only justification I've got is I find lots of shield bugs in there. There are solitary bees that go in and out, and I've no idea what they do. But every year I have orange tip butterflies, and because the wind comes from the east, they use the the yew hedge as a windbreak, and the male will go up and down all day on the right hand side of the yew hedge looking for females. And one of the key plants that you can have, and Mike mentioned plants underneath and on the banks of hedgerows, is Jack by the hedge or garlic mustard. So two butterflies, key butterflies, the orange tip butterfly and the green veined white butterfly, lay their eggs on Jack by the hedge. So, and anything which is in the mustard family is got good nectar for the insects. So I've omitted, but I do have other good hedges in my garden which we've planted out, and hopefully there is good forage for the pollinators. So I was walking in Manchester the weekend, and we were walking through some farmland, which is just adjacent to the Mersey. And this, I don't know, I've been driving around a lot in the last couple of weeks, and I don't know if anyone else has noticed the amount of hawthorn. It's been an absolutely fantastic year for hawthorn. And this principally is a hawthorn hedge. And if you look at this hedge, it's been trimmed, and it's kept trimmed because it's on the either side of a track. And if it was let to go wild, and it would infringe on the track, and you wouldn't be able to get vehicles up and down. So it's been trimmed down quite heavily. In this hedge, you can see a bit of hazel, you can see a bit of elder, and the hawthorn in flower, but there's nothing really there. And so one of the key points about a hedgerow is that if you over prune and over tidy it, the trees or the plants that are within the hedgerow don't get a chance to flower. And if they don't get a chance to flower, they're not there to providing nourishment for, and that's one of the key principles or key things for a hedgerow. They're not providing the nourishment for the insects and the pollinators. So one, we should try and let our hedgerows grow a little bit larger, and two, we should try and have a lot of variety within. So this is a wild hedgerow just opposite the entrance to my house, and this survives throughout the year. So hedgerows, for me as an amateur, provide just three key basic things for pollinators. The first one is nourishment. That's food. And the more variety we have of plants we have within a hedgerow, that's the more nourishment, and it extends the season. And I talk about starting with blackthorn at the beginning of the season and ending in ivy. So this hedgerow has been through the blackthorn. It's got some hawthorn in it. You can see the ivy on the left-hand side going up on an old ash tree. The two little spike branches going vertically are old man's beard, which is wild clematis that runs right through this hedge. We've got some hazel in this hedge. We've got some elder in this hedge, and further down we've got some field maple. And it's a bit of a fringe, but you can see in the front you've got some cow parsley growing, and there'll be some other wildflowers growing in the bottom. So nourishment is key. It's a home. It's a home for the pollinators to nest and to survive the season. And finally, it's a means of travel. So quite aptly, this is by a road. It's the insects which habit and look and rely on the hedgerows don't travel very far. They maybe travel a few hundred meters. And having hedgerows which have got good nourishment and good homes, it enables the insects to travel, and by traveling to different areas, then they will mate with the same insects from different areas, and therefore increase and improve the genetics of the insects, and they can survive. We can influence the hedgerows that are out there. So this is my local golf course. This is what it's brilliant. This is just down the side of a fairway. The golf course has taken on board the hedgerows. It leaves them a good margin. This was all full of cowslips. You just see the end of the cowslips coming through, buttercups coming through. Then there's going to be vetch coming through on the grass. The shrubs are all left to be in a full rounded shapes, therefore they can provide as much nourishment. And when you go down just beyond those trees, which there are great crops of sloes in the autumn. So both humans and insects can benefit from having a good hedgerow by planning it and including in there. And also in there would be a bit of crabapple. So I just wanted to show you some pictures of when I'm talking about pollinators, what pollinators there are. The top left-hand corner is, it looks really quite a placid little, it's actually a hoverfly. It's a thick-headed hoverfly. So it's a member of the fly family, and you can tell it's a member of the fly family because it's got two wings. It's got its antennae come out the front of its face and just branch out. You can see a little V at the front. And it has its thorax, which an insect will have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. Those are the three body parts. Between the thorax and the abdomen is all one piece. There's no waistline in there, let's call it that. Although this looks like a nice hoverfly sitting on a sycamore flower, it actually predates on bumblebees and solitary bees. In mid-flight, it lands on them, lays its eggs inside, the host then dies, and the hoverfly then eggs nurture and come out. A more classic fly is down the bottom left-hand corner, and that's on a spring raspberry, a flowering currant for early in the season. And you can see that it's got a mouthpiece which is in there taking nectar or something from the flower. So flies have two types of mouthpieces. One is a tongue, a long tongue, like you can see on the bumblebees, and quite often those ones are the ones that pierce you and give you bites. And then there's the padded ones which suck things up. And this one obviously looks like it's got a tongue to go in there and take some food. So the fly family are key, are good pollinators, and they shouldn't be disregarded. In fact, hoverflies, there are just as many species of hoverflies as there are bees in this country, and they're not really well studied, and they need to be studied further. One of my favorites is, and it's the only one photograph I haven't got because I spent hours sitting there at my comfrey beds watching this hairy-footed flower bee. It looks like a bumblebee, but it's not. It's a solitary bee. And it looks like it's got pollen on its legs. It's not. It's just the colouring of its hairs on its legs. And it's got a long tongue. And the long tongue, because anyone who knows about comfrey, it goes long tube, just like the flowering currant has in the bottom left-hand corner. And it comes along. And when you're watching a comfrey bed, you'll see bumblebees coming in. And then you'll hear what sounds like a helicopter, and it's the hairy-footed flower bee. And they are absolutely impossible to take a photograph of. They just move so fast. As soon as you take your camera out and start to take a photograph, they move on. Then I've got below that on a hellebore, I've got another solitary bee, and this shows you the distinct parts of a solitary bee. So it's got, of a bee really, it's got a head with two antennae. The antennae are off the side of the head. It's got a thorax, which has got some orange hair on it, and it's got an abdomen. But you can see between the thorax and the abdomen that it comes into a waist. It's sometimes called a wasp waist or a petiole. And the wasp waist signifies all the bees. All bees and ants and wasps all have a petiole, all have a wasp's neck waist. I find it impossible. There's certain numbers of solitary bees you can identify, and any one day I can go out into my garden and I'll find at least 6 different species, but you don't know if it's the male or the female. The male version of the hairy-footed flower bee looks very much like the one which is on the hellebore there. The males and females can differ quite drastically, but it's really great going out and just trying to find different ones. And then we've got the classic bumblebee. That's an early bumblebee coming out and feeding on the bell heather, and that's a queen bumblebee, comes out early in the spring. The top right, feeding on an achillea. This actually is a cultivar, but the achillea is another great wildflower. The white achillea you'll see along the hedgerows, along the edges, and this is a thick-thighed beetle, flower beetle. And what distinguishes a beetle is the front wings are hard. They're hardened. And they because beetles live in the ground and they burrow. So what you want is, when you're providing hedgerows, you're wanting to provide space underneath for the beetles to go down and feed and make their homes. So that is all part of making homes for the insects. The key numbers of solitary bees, most of them are mining bees. They drill down into the ground and they make their nests on an annual basis. And the last photograph there is of a flower in, I was walking in Turkey, and the point there is we've got a couple of beetles on there, and I have no idea what it is, but I suspect it's I suspect it's a wasp, but I don't know. It's got lots of hairs on it. It's got antennae that come out the side, but nothing. But the point of that is that you don't always find just one species of pollinator on a plant. They share them around. If anyone's got has a poppy grandifolia, which is the very large poppy heads, just in the middle of the summer, stand there, you'll see bees of different types, and I've counted up to 10 different bees in one head. And the bumblebee comes in, and the bumblebee's got a very unique thing. It does buzz pollination, and when it goes in there, you can hear it pollinating, and it's shaking the pollen off the anthers within the flower before it comes back out again. So one thing which I'm keen on, this is a Hawthorn Hedge, and you can see up the top middle, we've got a drone fly, so it's mimicking a drone bee. And down here, it blurred a bit, is a nomad solitary bee, which I didn't realize was going to appear in the picture. And you can see that this is a very open flower. And the most solitary bees, so the bees which I've got are most solitary bees and hoverflies don't have long tongues. You're wanting open flowers. And this hawthorn is a member of the rose family, the Rosaceae family. And you can normally tell a Rosaceae family, it's got 5 petals, and the anthers, which have got all the pollen on them, are in multiples of 5. And you can see there's in different states. So you've got the ones which are brown or darkish looking, they've gone over. The ones which are grey are about to go over, and there should be some red in here, and they're the ones which are the insects, some red in the foreground which come there. So if I was going to do a small planting plan for increasing the forage and making a hedgerow pollinator friendly, to encourage them and to provide them with a forage throughout the season, I would start with I would stick primarily to the rose family, the Rosaceae family. I'd have some blackthorn in there. Blackthorn's flowers early. It is good, and for the early insects coming out, it's brilliant. Crabapple. The crabapple has lasted for ages this year in the hedgerow. So just at the back of our garden, we've got a large crabapple, and the blossom just finished maybe 2-3 weeks ago. It's gone on and on this year. Hawthorn. Hawthorn, a lot of people think, oh, lots of hawthorn out there, lots of honey. I think in the last century, we only had about 10 years of good hawthorn honey crop. One of the things about the Rosaceae family is that the nectar is high in water content. So it can be up to 80% water and 20% sugars. And bees, which are of a sophisticated family, let's say honeybees, they do a calculation about the amount of energy to go and collect the nectar to the amount of sugar they're going to get. And quite often they will ignore orchards, they will ignore hawthorn, they will ignore blackthorn because the sugar content is low. So that makes them ideal secondary providers for insects which don't have complex mouthparts and don't have complex societies. So blackthorn, crabapple, hawthorn, sweetbriar, wild rose, and bramble. If you can accept bramble being in your hedgerow, it is absolutely fantastic. There are over 200 species of bramble, and the bramble season goes on and on and on throughout the season. So it's a great source of forage. Old man's beard, which is wild clematis, which I saw. Honeysuckle. If you put some honeysuckle within a hedgerow, it's great for the nighttime moths. So we have moths which are day moths, like the hawk moths, but the vast majority of them come out in the evening, and then honeysuckle is a great source of nectar for them. And finally, putting in some ivy, and letting the ivy flower at the end of the season, because that is the last forage for all insects. So hedgerows also provide homes. This is a picture of an ant's nest, actually, but an ant is a member of the Hymenoptera family. It just doesn't fly. So it is basically the same as a wasp or a bee. So the whole family, the whole species are great miners. So the bees can go into, solitary bees make their own holes. Bumblebees prefer to have old mouse nests or things like that, or little crevices. And solitary bees will go down and mine. And also some will even make their nests inside the stems of the bramble. So here is a aggregation of solitary bees. So the solitary bees, they live in a tube themselves. The mother lays a bunch of eggs which are female, and the last couple maybe will be male, and puts them in a tube. And these are there. And then what happens is the males come out first, and they wait for the females, and then they pounce on the females, and it's always good for them to have an aggregation, so they all nest quite close together. So having good subsoil underneath the hedgerow is great. And hedgerows are great for meeting partners, routes to meeting partners. These are soldier beetles on a wild carrot. You can tell it's a wild carrot because it's got a little red dot in the middle. And on here we've got soldier beetles, and so by having lots of forage for them to move and meet partners and to mate is a great thing. We've also got 4 species of fly, one here, one here, one here, and one here. So having hedgerows, they provide nourishment, they provide good homes, they provide a means of travel to meet other bees and other insects. If I was going to do some planning, I'd base it on a rosaceae family, and maybe with a bit of other bits added in. And making lots of field margins around the hedgerows gives lots of space for the bees to find homes. One word of warning. So this is a photograph I took at the weekend, and it was a very big lilac tree, and stuck in the back of a lilac tree is a holly bush. And it's like taking a horse to water and will it drink? On the lilac tree bush, there were only solitary bees, because these were much easier flowers for the solitary bees to take their forage from. And on the holly, only honeybees and bumblebees, because they had the tongues, the strong tongues, to be able to push down and suck up the nectar. So we have to provide variety, because we don't know what the insects are going to go find for their nourishment. Lots of variety, lots of plants is actually a good plan. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was brilliant, absolutely fascinating. I've certainly learned lots there, especially my favourite. A hairy-footed flower bee. What a wonderful name. That's just brilliant. I love it, absolutely love it. So yeah, that's great. Thank you both of you. They were really super presentations. So we'll just have a look through now and see some of the questions that people are posting. Let's have a look. We've got one about grandfather's beard, old man's beard, and being beneficial, but I think you've covered that, and it sounds like it is a beneficial plant to have in the hedgerows. Unless you've got anything else to add to that one, Sean. Someone was asking whether that's a good one to have in. On old man's beard. That is a good one to have in, isn't it? Yeah.
People don't always like old man's beard because it can take over. Sometimes you have to manage it.
Yeah. Okay. What is buzz pollination? Megan has asked. You mentioned that. I think one of you mentioned. You mentioned that, didn't you? About buzz pollination.
So if you most insects and flowers have a relationship, and the insect goes into the flower, and the pollen is caught on the hairs of the insect, and then by going on to the next flower, there are ways in which that pollen is passed on. But bumblebees, what they do is they vibrate at a certain frequency, which causes the pollen to fall off the anthers. and it's good. So it's used commercially in tomato. Mike will know more about this than I do, but it's used commercially in tomato glass houses for pollinating tomatoes. If you look at a foxglove, you'll see the bumblebee always goes up into the flower of the foxglove. Just listen to the bumblebee. When it goes in, it changes its frequency, and that's it, just buzz pollinating, and it's just forcing the pollen off the anthers. It's great.
Fascinating, amazing. Great. So we've got a question from Jill, who's a primary forest school leader. And this is a question for both of you, can maybe chip into this one. She says she covers a huge number of topics when outside, but a few she needs to focus. She wants to focus the children to make it easier for them to make a start on this whole sort of topic area. So what would be your starting point in this whole big topic if you were dealing with young people in the forest school? Anywhere you'd sort of entry level, where would you think would be a good entry point for this whole pollinator topic? Either of you, John?
Yeah, I mean, if it's pollinators or creepy crawlies you're interested in, I mean, my first reaction was, well, it's always great to put some pitfall traps down, so you can just get some plastic cups, go out the day before, bury them wherever you're going to do a walk or run the class for the school. Go out the day before and put some plastic cups, dig them into the ground, and then if you come back the next day, you'll be amazed at the number of different things that you'll have collected in that plastic cup, and there'll be beetles, spiders, all sorts in there. And if you put a few of them around, then they'll be really good to explore the next day and get up close and personal, I guess, with the different insects and bugs that are caught in that pitfall trap. I mean, it's a really fun thing to do. We've done them in our garden as well, and it's amazing the kind of stuff you pick up. So that would be my recommendation: is put out some pitfall traps, I think, so you can get close to some of the creepy crawlies.
Fantastic, good tip. Any particular tips from you, Sean, in terms of for young people or children, getting them interested in this topic?
There is one that it's from the Centre of Hydrology, which I think, Mike, you've done some stuff with, which is you can put a meter square. They've got all the documentation for it. They've got sheets which identify insects. You put a square on a flower bed or a wildflower bed, and you just count over 15 minutes the number of pollinators that come in and go out, and all you've got to do is classify them generically into bees or whatever. I can't remember. It's gone off the top of my head what the name of the program is. Yeah,
it's actually the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme. So if you have a look, they've got a website, the POMS scheme, POMS, UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, and yeah, there's a really good kind of toolkit and guide there to carry out your own pollinator survey. And what's really good about the pollinator monitoring scheme is you go there, you don't need any experience, you just follow the kind of instructions. Yeah, as Sean says, you observe an area of flowering plants and you record what you see, but then you can upload your data, and so there's loads of people doing this up and down the country, and the data gets used to track pollinators through time, and so we can measure how their populations are changing. So by carrying out one of these fit counts, they're called, you can really contribute to the data set, so we understand these pollinators better. Yeah, so that's a really good idea as well to do that.
Great. I suppose anything that gets young people actually watching and looking is a good thing, isn't it? Just to observe and see the different insects coming in and out. Somebody's asked a question about nettles, which often come up in sessions like this, whether nettles are good for pollinators and are they good for hedges? So in terms of us as gardeners or whatever, should we be keeping those nettles in there, and what are they good for?
Mike, you? Or...
No, you go for it, Sean. Yeah.
The peacock butterfly lays its eggs on the nettle. So it's an early butterfly over winter, so and having nettles for that. And not to get confused between types of stinging nettles and non-stinging nettles, because the non-stinging nettles are a good source of forage. They and so they're good to have. So having some nettles around all the time is good if you want to encourage and support some of the butterfly species.
Okay. And what about us stinging nettles as well as stinging nettles as well? Fantastic. Okay. What else have we got? Here's one for you, Mike, to do with the natural enemies that you mentioned in your talk. Is it possible to actually estimate the financial value of those natural enemies? So in terms of, you know, the value of them economically in terms of our agricultural sector, is that something that is being worked on, or that it's possible to calculate?
It is possible. It can be quite a kind of complex question to try and answer, but it's really important information, and that's a really good question. So we do research on pollinators and natural enemies at the University of Reading, and we've looked at valuing the contribution of pollinators to pollinating crops in the UK, and people are also trying to put a value on that kind of pest control that these natural enemies carry out, and there are estimates, and it's considerable, but there's several different ways you can kind of calculate it. You could try and calculate it as the value of them in terms of the increased yield that a crop would produce, and obviously that crop has a value. So if you're able to produce more crop in a field because those natural enemies are controlling the pests, then that's an economic value that natural enemy provides, and you can calculate that. But also there are important contributions that natural enemies make that also have an economic and environmental value as well. For example, if you're growing a crop and you've got lots of natural enemies around and they're controlling the pests on that crop, so that it's less necessary to apply an insecticide or pesticide to control those pests, that of course provides an economic benefit as well. You don't need to spend as much on controlling those pests. So it can be calculated, and it depends on different crops and different natural enemies what their economic value is, but it can be calculated, and it's a really important value to work out as well, because it helps you establish how valuable these really important invertebrates are. So yeah, it can be done.
Oh, fascinating. Really, yeah, like I say, really useful in terms of making the case for a lot of this work. A practical question now around what is the best time of year to start a new hedge. So if anyone's inspired to plant a new hedge after National Hedgerow Week, is there a particular time of year that it's best to start a new hedge? In terms of autumn time for planting, but are there any particular sort of pros or cons around new hedges? I mean, you gave some good guidance, Sean, about the species that you would be on your top list for planting a hedge of pollinators. Is there anything else you'd advise for someone thinking of a new hedge?
Well, the best thing is to try and go for the bare rooted. Bare rooted is best value for money. Yeah. And they don't come available until the autumn. Most hedgerow suppliers, you have to place orders now for collection of bare root in the autumn and for planting over the winter. And that's the best, but most economical way of planting a reasonable hedge. And you can buy, so I know the local suppliers in Buckinghamshire, you can choose the nature of hedge you want the planting for. So it could be soft hues, it could be edible, it could be, or whatever, or you can just mix and match your own. But buying bare rooted and following the instructions on how you mix them, how you have maybe a main theme and you have two different varieties every meter, then that's going. But it's much easier to plant it out in the autumn, and it's makes more economic sense to do it in the autumn.
Yeah, okay. We will, when we, as we mentioned earlier, we are doing a recording of the session, and when we share the session with everybody, we will put some links in there for some useful resources around some of the things we've touched on this evening, including some links to our website and HedgeThink's website around advice on planting and those kind of things. So some of the things we've touched on tonight will steer you to some additional resources. And also we'll add some of the questions that we haven't had time to answer, because I'm afraid we're at the end of our session now, and we haven't been able to cover all the questions, but we will pick up on some of those separately, and we'll put them in an email that we send around to everybody. So sorry to those of you who we haven't managed to get your questions in. So yeah, that was a really great session. Thank you ever so much, Mike and Sean, for really, really interesting, engaging sessions. Loads of beautiful photographs. So even though we're not outside, it's like we've been watching the outside inside. So it's been really lovely seeing the insects and the plants that you've been showing this evening. And thank you to all our attendees for joining us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the session. Do enjoy watching it again, share it with others who haven't been able to join. And we have still got a few more hedge talks for the rest of the week. We've got the link in the chat there. And again, oh yeah, John's just added it again. So do have a look. We've got Saturday is one all about birds, and tomorrow evening is around hedgerow management. And we've also got an urban hedgerows one tomorrow as well. So we've got 3 more before the end of the week. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening and the rest of National Hedgerow Week.